Hello, good evening. Welcome to Novara Live. My name's Stephen Methven, and tonight I'm joined by a brand new co-host, but someone who isn't a stranger to the media at all. Myriam, François, how are you doing?
All the better for joining you.
Thanks very much for being here. I've been a fan for a long time, as I said. Why don't you tell the viewers, if they're not familiar, I'm sure many are, where they can find more of your work?
Sure. So I have a website, which is myriamfrancois.com, but you can also find me on Instagram under Ms. François, which is MYZ, and then my surname, François. And I am the host of a YouTube show called The Tea with Myriam François, which I recommend you all subscribe to.
Thanks very much, Myriam. So coming up tonight on the show, Trump and Musk take aim at South Africa's land expropriation laws. Labour take a hard right turn on migration, no surprises there. And the Home Office takes flak for paying self-declared incels to take part in a survey. Despite widespread international condemnation, Donald Trump has doubled down on his call for the entire population of Gaza to be permanently displaced to other countries. Posting on Truth Social, he said this: "The Gaza Strip would be turned over to the United States by Israel at the conclusion of fighting. The Palestinians, people like Chuck Schumer, would have already been resettled in far safer and more beautiful communities with new and modern homes in the region. They would actually have a chance to be happy, safe, and free. The US, working with great development teams from all over the world, would slowly and carefully begin the construction of what would become one of the greatest and most spectacular developments of its kind on Earth. No soldiers by the US would be needed. Stability for the region would reign." On Tuesday, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt seemed to contradict Trump's initial suggestion that the relocation would be permanent.
"I can confirm that the president is committed to rebuilding Gaza and to temporarily relocating those who are there because, as I've showed you repeatedly, it is a demolition site. There is no running water. There is no electricity. The president wants these individuals to live in peace. He is committed to doing that with this very bold new plan, and we will continue to keep you apprised of updates as we receive them."
Now, in an interview with Fox News, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also suggested relocation could be temporary.
The actual idea of allowing first Gazans who want to leave. I mean, what's wrong with that? They can leave, they can then come back, they can relocate and come back, but you have to rebuild Gaza. If you want to rebuild Gaza, you can't have, this is the first good idea that I've heard.
Given everything we know about Netanyahu's politics, the systematic obliteration of Gaza over the past 15 months, and of course the broader history of occupied Palestine, it's hard to believe that displaced Palestinians would really be allowed to return. And of course, framing the relocation as temporary, and therefore voluntary, is a way to counter allegations of ethnic cleansing. But under international law, attempts to forcibly transfer populations from occupied territory are strictly prohibited. With this in mind, it's worth taking a closer look at the wording of some of the criticism of Trump's plan. Here's what UK Foreign Minister Annalisa Dodds told MPs. She said, "We would oppose any effort to move Palestinians in Gaza to neighbouring Arab states against their will. There must be no forced displacement of Palestinians, nor any reduction in the territory of the Gaza Strip." Now, in international law, forcible transfer doesn't only mean literally forcing people from their homes at gunpoint. The existing legal framework also covers the creation of what they call coercive conditions that make life untenable and make it impossible to remain. That's the framework that's already been used in different parts of the occupied West Bank. And it's unclear whether the UK government and other US allies would support a resettlement plan that's framed as voluntary, even if Palestinians basically have no real choice. This would unambiguously amount to the war crime of forcible transfer. But Israel has committed numerous war crimes in Gaza without losing our government support. Myriam, do you think that we're going to see the UK government and other world leaders begin to endorse this kind of fictional idea that if Palestinians leave Gaza, which is a catastrophe, it could in any sense of the word be truly voluntary?
Well, I can tell you from all the Palestinians that I know in Gaza that there will be no voluntary departure from Gaza by Palestinians, except those who would wish for a temporary medical evacuation, most of whom have been denied that, including over 14,000 children who are seriously injured and could use evacuation. So I think that there's, as usual with the Trump administration, a whole load of what I call the bamboozle tactic. It's throw completely ridiculous proposals out there. Everyone has a panic about them. And then the real story, the real issues somehow get sidelined. So let's start from where we need to discuss, which is that today it's Israel that needs to be held accountable for the destruction of Gaza. But of course, the US is central to what has been going on, which is both a genocide and an attempt at ethnic cleansing in many ways through genocide and of course, throughout the whole of Palestine today. And the US is a key actor in that. The notion that they are somehow a separate entity to Israel, I think, requires some rethinking of how Israel and why Israel was created. $23 billion of US taxpayer money was handed over to Israel to conduct these operations. 4 UN Council resolutions were vetoed by the US for a ceasefire. I think we need to set aside the notion that the US administration has the interests of the Palestinian people at heart in any way, shape, or form, and instead consider the ways in which, with the growing strength of the global South and wider international community, remind ourselves, as Francesca Albanese did in recent days, that America, albeit one powerful country, is just one country. And that perhaps we as an international community need to start thinking about how we can find ways to push back, sanction, and hold accountable those who are undertaking and funding genocide.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there's a kind of collusion, though, that I think that happens amongst the media and our political classes, where, as you say, Israel is never held to account. So even when Trump was speaking, when he pitched this literally insane proposal, he talked about Gaza being a demolition zone, it having been bombed, et cetera, while standing right next to the man who was responsible for it and never, ever bringing that to light. And I think the same thing happens a lot in Parliament, for example. People sort of, they pitch what's happened in Gaza as a kind of random humanitarian disaster. And now they're looking for solutions to a random humanitarian disaster, which doesn't involve actually, as you say, holding Israel to account for being responsible for not only that disaster, but many of the disasters that Palestinians have faced over the previous 7 decades.
And of course, this is all part of the theatrics of distraction. I would love for a reporter to put to them the question of whether the tens of thousands or over 10,000 Palestinians who have fled into Egypt, for example, when they still could prior to April last year, are they allowed to return? Because we were told this was like a temporary relocation. So step one in trust building, I want to see those people go home. And if they can't go home for whatever reason, amicable bullshit. Sorry, I don't know if we can swear on the show, but it's worth stating that at this point we need to call BS on, ridiculous proposals. The suggestion, that Palestinians want to leave their land despite fighting a 76-year struggle for liberation to remain in their land is unlikely to be welcomed, not least the actual practicalities involved in moving just under 2 million people. I mean, there were 2.3 million people, of course, in Gaza before Israel's assault. But according to Trump, and presumably the figures he's been briefed on, we're now talking about 1.7, 1.8. I'll leave you guys to do the maths, but they're not great figures when we are still talking about a death toll along the official lines of the allegedly unreliable Hamas-run health ministry in the tens of thousands. So I think it's just really important for all of us observing the circus to remind ourselves that first and foremost, Donald Trump is a reality TV star. And I think it's probably worth reminding ourselves that that probably is still what he is.
Now, what should matter most anyway isn't what international leaders think, but what Palestinians in Gaza want in terms of their fate. Palestinians have the same legal right to self-determination as any other people, and a binary choice between relocation and remaining and suffering in what is now an apocalyptic wasteland isn't true freedom of action. Under those conditions, it's hard to describe leaving as voluntary in any sense of the word. However, even in these harsh conditions, many Gazans have pledged to remain steadfast on their land.
Thank God, no. This is a land of resistance, and we want it. Currently, no, but God is with us. And if God wills it, after 10 years, we will live like the rest of the world. Thank God He won't be able to, because God is with us. No one can be against us. We are on the side of truth, and God is with us. Let Him say what He wants. We won't leave. We have no homes or jobs, but we will resist despite Trump. I lost 3 houses, not 1, and we have many martyrs. 10 people died in our house alone. If God wills, we will resist. If we sell the land, everyone will sell it. No, we will resist in Gaza if God wills. We don't want anything from Trump. If he is against us, it's no problem. They demolished the house on our heads and we went out. And my brother got injured in the head. We left my brother. I personally would not have left Gaza City. I walked a long way to Mahlat Salim to bring a piece of cardboard to eat with my brothers. They want to take us out of Gaza, but they can't. I wouldn't leave Gaza City. We can die and live in humiliation. We won't leave Gaza. Gaza is not inhabitable at all. There's no place or water. We go to the end of the world. From Seka area in Jabalia, we go to Salah al-Din route to get water to drink. They won't be able to take us out of Gaza. This is the land I was born in, and I won't leave it. And if they can take us, let them come. The people of Gaza are stubborn. We've seen death and bombings and didn't leave. And he wants to come. I swear by God, we will kill them all. We will stay in Gaza. Neither Trump nor any other human can take us from here. This is our land.
So some strong descriptions there of the conditions under which Palestinians in Gaza are living, and also a strong expression of their resistance to being budged even an inch. But others in the enclave say they would leave because the extent of the devastation has made it impossible to remain.
I support it. I will leave Gaza. If our sons and daughters leave, I will leave too. This is the tragedy we live in, the war, the destruction of our homes and the family members who are martyred. The life we live, the poverty. It has become a humiliating life. We were victims of injustice during it. Whoever wants to leave, will leave. And whoever doesn't want to, that's their choice. But if he wants to take people and give them a safe life, I am one of the people who will leave. Why? The poverty. No houses, water and food problems. Our fear for our children. No electricity. No life. Only the future will show the seriousness of these words. But here there are people who resist. And others say they want to emigrate due to despair and what they've lived through. Some came from the south, where they'd been displaced from the north, and returned again to the south because they discovered that Gaza has no life, because their homes and lives had collapsed. They say what we achieved in years collapsed in a day. There is no life. Whoever says there is life is not sincere.
Now, if you've seen any of the aerial footage of Gaza that's been taken since the ceasefire came into place, I think you could forgive anybody for feeling hopeless in that destroyed territory. And of course, it's people who remain hopeful and resistant that really deserving of such admiration, because it can often be difficult to imagine that oneself in those circumstances would remain hopeful and full of resistance. Israel's Defense Minister Israel Katz has now ordered the Israeli military to prepare plans to allow Palestinians, quote, who wish to leave Gaza to exit via land, sea and air. Now, even before the recent genocidal war, Israel had total control over Gaza's borders and airspace, which is a key reason it remained legally classified as occupied after Israeli settlements were dismantled in 2007. Myriam, what do you think is going to happen? Will Trump and Netanyahu get their way? Or is there a chance that Gaza can be rebuilt with Palestinians allowed to remain?
I think, first of all, we probably need a real independent external assessment of the extent of the damage. I mean, we obviously see aerial footage. We know the entire neighborhoods, particularly in the north, have been completely leveled. I interviewed a doctor who just returned recently who described Jabalia as somewhere that looked like it had had several nuclear bombs dropped on it. So clearly we need an assessment of what would realistically be the time frame for bringing about, and let's be honest, what we're talking about are really, really basic logistics of running water, a healthcare system, an education system, and some basic housing. And we are very far away from having, I think, a true picture of what would be necessary to do that. What I will say is I think that the will of the Palestinian people in Gaza to remain is overwhelmingly strong. As you said, I don't think we would have any judgment for anyone who would want to leave, but that certainly is not what I'm hearing predominantly. And I think the real question is, to what extent can the international community, almost regardless of the US proposal, come up with a plan for the reconstruction of Gaza with Palestinians remaining in their land? What does that look like? How quickly can it be undertaken? And I think, the signals that we're getting from both Jordan and Egypt is that they have no desire to take in millions of refugees into their countries, even under the I think it's fair to say pretense that Netanyahu is suggesting that it would be temporary. It probably is worth stating for audiences who aren't as familiar with the situation in Gaza that many people who leave Gaza are never able to return. There are friends of mine who left Gaza thinking they would return a year later and who have been unable to return. The Israelis systematically look for excuses to justify disallowing a re-entry of Palestinians to their land, whether that is in Gaza or the West Bank and Jerusalem. This is part of a wider systematic policy of ethnic cleansing. That is, of course, the war is one end of it, but the other is a kind of bureaucratic system that ensures that Palestinians are consistently and persistently disallowed from access to their land, whether it's by traveling there or be in some cases simply having access to land that they own, even if they are in the land itself.
Elon Musk is a lot of things. He's the world's richest man, on paper anyway, a believer in state contracts for his own businesses, if not for anyone else's, a provocateur, and now a new media magnate. He's also a white South African, and he has the ear of the US President Donald Trump. That may explain this recent statement from Trump.
So on Truth Social, you said that you were going to cut aid from South Africa. Will you plan to cut aid across other African nations, and why South Africa?
No, it's only South Africa. Terrible things are happening in South Africa. The leadership is doing some terrible things, horrible things. So that's under investigation right now. We'll make a determination. And until such time as we find out what South Africa is doing, they're taking away land, they're confiscating land, and actually they're doing things that are perhaps far worse than that.
Now, that announcement targeting South Africa with cut of aid had an immediate impact on the South African economy. South Africa's currency, the rand, weakened against the dollar. South African stocks fell and government bonds tumbled, making borrowing more expensive. So what are these terrible things the South African government is supposedly doing? In a Truth Social post, Trump gave his take on the details. South Africa is confiscating land and treating certain classes of people very badly. It is a bad situation that the radical left media doesn't want to so much as mention. A massive human rights violation, at a minimum, is happening for all to see. The United States won't stand for it. We will act. Also, I will be cutting off all future funding to South Africa until a full investigation of this situation has been completed. The certain classes of people Trump refers to are white South Africans, but nobody actually is confiscating their land. South Africa's president, Cyril Ramaphosa, responded to Trump with this. South Africa is a constitutional democracy that is deeply rooted in the rule of law, justice, and equality. The South African government has not confiscated any land. The recently adopted Expropriation Act is not a confiscation instrument, but a constitutionally mandated legal process that ensures public access to land in an equitable and just manner as guided by the Constitution. South Africa, like the United States of America and other countries, has always had expropriation laws that balance the need for public usage of land and the protection of rights of property owners. We look forward to engaging with the Trump administration over our land reform policy and issues of bilateral interest. We are certain that out of these engagements, we will share a better and common understanding of these matters. The US remains a key strategic, political, and trade partner for South Africa, with the exception of PEPFAR aid, which constitutes 17% of South Africa's HIV/AIDS program. There is no other funding that is received by South Africa from the United States. Now, that PEPFAR aid was in fact cut off by the US, or at least suspended for 90 days, I think it was. Now, the law Ramaphosa is referring to is South Africa's updated Land Expropriation Act, signed into law just last month. It's an update on the Apartheid-era Land Expropriation Act of 1975. The law is controversial in South Africa, which currently has a government of national unity composed of several parties from across the political spectrum. It includes Ramaphosa's ANC, as well as the white-led, business-friendly Democratic Alliance, which opposes the act. But even the Democratic Alliance rejected Trump's claims, saying, quote, "It is not true that the act allows land to be seized by the state arbitrarily, and it does require fair compensation for legitimate expropriations." It's worth noting that the act has also been criticized by other black-led parties in the government. The updated act has been passed in an effort to speed up land reform in South Africa. Now, this is a difficult topic in the post-apartheid context, particularly given the extreme wealth inequality that is a lasting legacy of that apartheid system. This is from Associated Press. A 2021 study by the South African Human Rights Commission found that 64% of black people were living in poverty against 1% of white people. When it comes to land, white people make up about 7% of the population of 62 million, and own around 70% of land, according to the most recent land audit, although that share has decreased since apartheid. So you can imagine what it was under apartheid. It's clear that in South Africa, relatively little progress has been made on either of the connected issues of poverty and land reform since apartheid ended 30 years ago. And it's not clear that the new act will do much to move the dial. A South African constitutional lawyer wrote this about the potential impact of the new law. Land reform also needs a capable and proactive state that implements the legal framework in such a manner that prioritizes expropriation as a mechanism to ensure land reform. So far, expropriation has not been used effectively to redistribute land more equitably as part of land reform. I'm not convinced that the Act in its current form is the silver bullet to effect large-scale land reform, at least not the type of radical land reform that South Africa urgently needs. Understandably, the Act will have a severe impact on property rights, but it still substantially protects landowners affected by expropriation. Only in very limited cases would they not be compensated. And in fact, in those limited cases, on my understanding, it's if they refuse an offer of compensation. Now, of course, it may be just too much to expect Elon Musk to grapple with the finer details of what's happening in South Africa, presuming he even cares about the actual truth. This was his response to South African President Cyril Ramaphosa. Why do you have openly racist ownership laws? Quite ironic coming from someone who grew up in apartheid-era South Africa. According to the South African press, Musk and Trump's views have been influenced by the lobbying of a group representing the interests of Afrikaans-speaking white South Africans. The group has been accused of comparing the South African government's new constitutional law to the radical land reforms that took place in Zimbabwe in the 2000s. They're also alleged to be spreading misinformation by asserting that white farmers are disproportionately the victims of violence, a claim that has been repeatedly debunked. I mean, South Africa is a very violent country. It's something worth pointing out. Now, I think that what's interesting here is Trump and Musk's willingness to take those claims by that lobbying group at face value. This is from a Guardian article published last month. Musk is part of the PayPal mafia of libertarian billionaires with roots in South Africa. Under white rule, now hugely influential in the US tech industry and politics. They include Peter Thiel, the German-born billionaire venture capitalist and PayPal co-founder, who was educated in a southern African city in the 1970s where Hitler was still openly venerated. I think that means Windhoek in what's now Namibia. Thiel, a major donor to Trump's campaign, has been critical of welfare programs and women being permitted to vote as undermining capitalism. A 2021 biography of Thiel, called The Contrarian, alleged that as a student at Stanford, he defended apartheid as economically sound. David Sachs, former PayPal's chief operating officer and now a leading fundraiser for Trump, was born in Cape Town and grew up within the South African diaspora after his family moved to the US when he was young. A fourth member of the mafia, Rudolf Botha, the grandson of the apartheid regime's last foreign minister, Pik Botha, and former PayPal CFO, has kept a low political profile, but remains close to Musk. And now a separate Financial Times article published last year makes this connection between Trump's advisors and apartheid. The white South African nightmare in the 1980s, hanging over everything, was that one day black people would rise up and massacre whites. Like the US, South Africa was a violent society and becoming more violent in the 80s. Musk's teenage recollections of seeing murders on trains may not be entirely factual, but do evoke the atmosphere of the era. He warned in 2023 about potential genocide of white people in South Africa. Trump's recent claim about American girls being raped and sodomized and murdered by savage criminal aliens preyed on similar white fears. If you're a libertarian who believes that inequality is natural and lives in fear of race war, you will be drawn towards a certain type of American politics. You certainly won't want government or institutions to try to intervene against racism. In 1995, a year after the ANC began attempting that in South Africa, Thiel and Sachs, who met at Stanford, published The Diversity Myth in the US. It's a well-written defense of Western civilization against multiculturalism, or what the right now calls woke, written by two white 20-somethings who are sure racism isn't the problem. Indeed, they explain, there are almost no real racists in America's younger generation. Myriam, what do you make of these connections between Trump and the tech bros who surround him and apartheid South Africa?
Well, first of all, it's worth noting that South Africa is the country leading the case of genocide at the International Court against Israel, right? So just coincidentally, we're suddenly seeing an economic attack by the US on the South African government and attempts to stir up, for sure, forms of racial tensions, which interestingly somewhat reflects a pattern that we're now observing from Musk and co et al., this little cohort of tech billionaires and their political allies. And that is the meddling in the workings of foreign governments. We saw it here in the UK. I mean, we have literally had Musk calling for, Starmer, whatever your thoughts on Starmer on this one, should go, asking the king to intervene. I mean, ludicrousness. And also, over the summer, providing support on social media to narratives that fed the race riots that we had here in the UK. So I think it's kind of interesting to observe some of these patterns. And it's then necessary to understand the role that, white supremacy as an ideology is playing at our current juncture. So I think, what we're saying is that there are these lobby groups, AfroForum, who represent the interests of Afrikaans-speaking white South Africans, many of whom are nostalgic for the actual era of apartheid, and who have been fueling notions of a white genocide happening in South Africa. And it's a classic thing, we've seen it throughout the genocide in Gaza. It's like every accusation is a confession. It's like, oh my God, the blacks are going to come and murder all the whites. It's like, well, hold on. Wasn't that kind of what you guys have been doing and are now doing in some variant still to the majority black population of South Africa? So, I also think that it's interesting to reflect on the notion of economic apartheid. So whilst we were very focused on the sort of dismantling of the sort of official structure of apartheid, really what apartheid was the segregation of society along racial lines to maintain, distinct classes of haves and have-nots, albeit in South Africa along racial lines. We still have economic apartheid in South Africa. There is still not only a huge economic divide, but a growing racial divide, economic and racial divide of the population. So to come to your point about the connection to these billionaires, I really would love to refer people to a book by Nafeez Ahmeed called Reich, which is all about the connections between the tech billionaires and the growing sort of white supremacist, far-right political groups across the world. And really what we see is a confluence of interest between those who wish to justify the rapid and unabashed accumulation of huge amounts of capital to the detriment of the majority in any country in which they're operating, with people who are beholden to an ideology that provides a very useful ideological lubricant for that perspective. In other words, which says, well, it's not just that you guys are, let's take the meritocratic myth that America is founded on, that you guys have just been particularly smart and good at what you've done, and therefore you deserve all the success, even though in most cases we're talking about people whose families had huge amounts of wealth in the background. But also these guys add another layer, which is to say, well, actually, there's these really inconvenient truths about like the biological differences that say that white people are actually biologically superior. And I would urge anyone watching this to really do a deep dive on Peter Thiel, in particular, the owner of PayPal. PayPal's founder is a horrific human being by any measure. And he is part of a wider network of individuals who have tried and continue to push the resurrection of a form of eugenics-based policies. The notion that the haves and have-nots, the inequality we're seeing, is not only morally justified through the sort of myth of some people are just hardworking, but can actually be justified through the notion that there are subhuman species who are not deserving of US aid and are certainly not deserving of a welfare state or any form of assistance. So I could talk a lot about this. I would also urge you to look at the libertarian philosophy that we find around these so-called tech bros. I was reading a tweet today by the founder of Roblox, who basically was saying, well, since we have created the new world, of course we should run it. I mean, okay. So, there is a very, very real risk of a form of tech authoritarianism seeping into our lives at a speed I wish I could say that I was being, overly concerned about, but I can't really emphasize enough that we are sleepwalking into a system in which the margins for resistance to these authoritarian white supremacist thinkers, thought leaders, it's happening now.
One of the most, I think, terrifying aspects of recent years is actually one of them getting hold of a platform which is such a major communications platform. And essentially, if I look at Twitter for myself now, and I go to the For You page, I just get a stream of really incendiary, racist, violent imagery and ideas. And that's obviously going into, lots of people constantly. And I think when people are fed a stream of that kind, people do have the ability to discriminate, do have the ability to, think for themselves, but there is something about just a constant stream of particular ideas being elevated and amplified that, makes you worry about the possibility of mass, or at least making these ideas seem more acceptable or explorable in a way. And I'm talking about white supremacy of the kind that you brought up there.
Yeah,
making them explorable,
completely normalized.
Completely normalized, exactly.
Completely normalized on X, and in fact, and it's worth saying that those of us who try and push against this on X are censored. So I have repeatedly tested this. If I criticize Elon Musk directly on X, I lose thousands of followers in one go. Sangeeta Miska's also tweeted about this. This is a real thing now, that not only are they flooding our centers of information with white nationalist, white supremacist ideas they're also funding thought leaders on social media, are YouTube pseudo-intellectuals that are leading the way in shaping the next generation. The Jordan Petersons, the Daily Wire clique, the Lex Friedmans are all heavily funded by people who have an interest in promoting their ideas. And Jordan Peterson himself has made statements in support of the notion that there are biological differences between humans that we shouldn't be denying when it comes to things like IQ. Okay, this guy has like almost 7 million followers on YouTube. He's by far one of the most referred to pseudo-intellectuals. We have no one of a commensurate standard. I mean, in terms of standing, not intellectual standard, because we have people who far outweigh him with the toenail. But I'm talking about the amount of money that has been pumped into promoting these people as thought leaders. And, it's time for the left to wake the fuck up. Wake the fuck up. Do you not see the writing on the wall? Because it's there. It's all over all the walls that they now control, because we have not been investing any money into any of these spaces.
Yeah, it's terrifying to think how hostage you are if you are trying to build the left in any way online, how hostage you are to the platforms that can be taken away from you at any time, can be completely transformed into a different kind of platform overnight as ownership changes or as the political winds change. Following calls by a group of 40 Labour MPs for the party to have a stronger message on immigration, Labour has launched an anti-immigration Facebook campaign with reform-style branding. Here's one example of what they've been posting. It says, "Breaking news, Labour hits 5-year high in migrant removals." And as you can see, the Labour logo is nowhere to be seen. And they're using a very similar colour scheme to Reform UK. The posts are being shared from a Facebook page called Migration Updates. And the campaign seems to be a direct response to the demands of the so-called Red Wall Group, a collective of MPs formed last autumn, some of whom represent seats which flipped from Labour to Tory in the 2019 election. Yesterday, Red Wall Group convener Joe White, MP for Bassetlaw, told the BBC the government should be shouting about the number of people who've been deported since Labour took power. She said, "The key issue in my constituency is immigration. We're not telling a strong story about what we are achieving." Now, given how quickly the Facebook campaign was launched, only a day after the Red Wall Group intervention, you have to wonder if the whole thing is being stage managed by Party HQ. Starmer, or Morgan McSweeney, if it's true, the Downing Street Chief of Staff is really the one calling the shots, might think it makes it easier to sell to Labour's base as a necessity. Unsurprisingly, Diane Abbott is unimpressed. She posted the following on Twitter before the launch of the Facebook campaign, but after the Red Wall Group comments. "Colleagues seem to think turning the Labour Party into Reform Light will save their parliamentary seat. Completely delusional." And she's picked an amazing image of Farage to go with it. I'm with Diane. If you insist to voters that reducing immigration should be a top priority, you're pushing them towards the party seen as strongest on that issue. Labour needs, clearly, a much more compelling alternative vision. If people really believe you're going to make their lives better, many will prioritise that over anti-immigration sentiment. When you're in government, that obviously means materially improving things now. Otherwise, it's just empty words. So, Myriam, why do you think Labour is so reluctant to present a positive vision?
I think the question almost be like, how can Labour, with everything we now know of the attempts by centre-right parties, which is basically what Labour is today, to adopt far-right policies to try and somehow win over their voters. We literally have a handbook across Europe of the fact that this fails, right? Every time these parties, especially on immigration, copy the hardline agendas of the far right, they only ever embolden the far right. And we've seen it systematically. We are now in the grips in Europe of a surge of the far right because of exactly this policy. So, I'm a little skeptical that it's the notion that it's somehow going to quote unquote work. I actually wonder whether there are not, extremists within the Labour Party itself who need to be identified as pushing the party down a route that we've seen happen in Europe and lead to really devastating circumstances. And when I say devastating, I mean, I could talk about my country of origin, France, where, the centrist Prime Minister François had previously spoken about the idea that French people are submerged by immigration, and which, the Rassemblement National, which is the French far right, had hailed as evidence that they had won the battle. If François Bayrou is saying this, then clearly, the far right doesn't need to win the battle, but they are also actually winning elections because of this strategy. In Austria, we are now set to see the country led by the first far right-led government since the Second World War. Austria, the center of Nazism. I mean, we talk about Germany, but Austria delivered its fair share of SS soldiers. The idea that essentially using the same imagery that Nigel Farage had used for the Brexit campaign, these kind of falsified images, because of course we knew that the picture that was used of all the Syrians trying to, moving through Europe was somehow all of them heading to the UK, when of course that was not the case. We're basically again in this pattern of selling people the delusion that the real people that they should be angry about are the poor people who are getting on boats to flee their countries for whatever reason. And there's a whole range of reasons we could cite, so that they can come and clean your toilets, are the real threat here. Not the billionaires and the millionaire class. Oh no, they're your friends. They're aspirational. They're who you want to be like. I just, I mean, Labour what at this point?
Yeah, I think it's there's, I guess if you look at America and you look at the UK, there's been this sort of period of, I guess in my mind, I haven't said it out loud before, I think of as sort of limboism, where one major party knows they'll have power for a bit and then they'll pass it to the other major party, two center parties essentially. But what's happened is, as a result of them both kind of agreeing in broad economic terms that, millionaires, the super wealthy are untouchable and the poor can always be squeezed for more, means that the right has found a gap. And those center-left parties, which, just continue, I mean, the center-right ones know what to do. They can move towards the further right parties. But the center-left ones, they have no other choice because they haven't really thought about this at all. And they've already given up a long time ago any of the principles that would have grounded them in the left, that wouldn't make it, for example, a huge economic shock if, for example, the taxes on the wealthy were marginally raised. Young and lonely men on the internet are a popular target for misogynistic online influencers who spout anti-woman hatred and sell bogus recipes for capitalistic success. Like this man.
You want to make it with girls, and you're running around talking to girls all day. You're never going to be as successful as if you make it outside of girls. Get your fitness right, get some muscles, get rich, get a big house, get famous, get smart, get charismatic, and now you make it in girls. The easiest way to make it in business is to make it outside of business. If you pull up to work, you're in shape, you're on time, you speak well, you're dedicated, and you're prepared to knuckle down, you're going to win.
Often called incels or involuntary celibates, with many self-identifying as such, they're increasingly discussed as an emerging risk, vulnerable to radicalization, or, in the case of boys, grooming, and potentially capable of violent extremist acts. In 2023, counter-terror police noticed a large rise in men being referred to the Prevent Counter-Extremism program over women-hating ideology. Now the Home Office's Commission for Countering Extremism has conducted a study on self-described incels, with participants paid for their involvement. 561 men in the UK and US took part in the research. Each was paid around £20 for completing a 40-minute survey. Justifying the payments, one of the lead researchers, Joe Whitaker, said this: "All of research ethics is about trade-offs between two competing goods. You have this issue of a very hard to reach, difficult to research population. Trying to find a way into that is definitely good. On the other side, I can understand why some people might take some level of objection to this, is that some incels are accused and in several cases have done some pretty bad stuff. I'm not just talking about ultra-violence. I'm talking about being, frankly, horrible misogynists. The thing that made us feel like it was a justifiable decision is that the problem with looking at content on the internet is that in almost all circumstances, it's driven by a very, very small number of people. Therefore, the problem that you get is when you start to make generalizations, such as all incels are terrible misogynists, you start to run up against this problem of, well, actually, are they? Or is it just the ones that actually did post? So who were the respondents? Well, they were recruited through social media posts and chat forums and were mostly in their mid-20s, heterosexual, childless, and chose involuntarily celibate as their relationship status. The findings were a mix of worrying and tragic. This is also from The Guardian. 99 respondents, or 18%, said they had communicated with another incel in person in the past year. When asked if violence against people whom incels perceive as causing harm to them could be justified, about 1/4 picked either sometimes or often. Slightly more than 5% said violence was often justified. The average response was never or rarely. The incels were said to typically display extremely poor mental health, with high instances of depression and suicidal ideation. 1 in 5 said they had contemplated suicide every day for the past 2 weeks. Now, I always find this a difficult topic to talk about. I mean, I feel a lot of compassion for people who are lonely and who don't have romantic lives, assuming that they want one. And I genuinely think of that as a real deprivation for most human beings, whatever their gender. So, yeah, I can feel some sort of compassion towards these men. But on the other hand, I find the reaction by some men turning to hate and a kind of poisonous self-pity so off-putting and obviously dangerous. Myriam, the article in The Guardian was sort of pitched about like, why are people paying these men to complete their surveys? I actually don't really have a problem with that. I think it's an important area to research.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but I guess my question for you is, look, how do we on the left, Andrew Tate is reaching these boys and men and people like him. There are a myriad people like him with their kind of the connection they make between like success with women and success in capitalism being like the very same thing. Your men experience love as totally conditional, therefore get good at having the conditions. So a false premise and then a bit of snake oil. So they're doing a good job of reaching these men and boys. How do the left do it? And should we even try?
So it's a good question. How's it working out for Andrew Tate right now? Just asking. I think that the incels are a symptom, obviously, of a problem, which is that it's such a manifold issue that young men are facing, and I think addressing it with compassion is the way to address it. The reality is that a lot of the so-called incel influencer types like Tate are proposing some fairly obvious points of advice, which I think is where, even a broken clock is right twice a day. Definitely do some exercise, definitely sort out your diet, definitely make your bed, all really good pieces of advice. Everything that follows thereafter, however, is predicated on the notion that your unhappiness, as we require it to be in a capitalist system, is all due to your personal failings. They're all due to you, little man, just being a mediocre little man. If you just tried harder. I mean, it's basically the whole meritocracy myth, but in the influencer version of it. And I think that what we could do well with highlighting is that at a time of loneliness, the remedy to loneliness is community. The remedy to economic, to poverty, which means that you probably can't really get a girlfriend because you probably want to like take her out to dinner or take her out to see a film, and all these things cost money and you don't have the money. That's due to the growing inequality. That means that there are people that have so much they couldn't spend it even if they lived for 1,000 years. And you can't even take your girlfriend out for a meal, even if you had one, that you can't afford a house, you can't afford to get married, you can't afford to have children. Who is responsible for all of these things? I understand that an easy way to look at it is that, feminism has encouraged women to hold men to higher standards. And I can understand that just like white people struggle to be held to account by people of color, because we have been so used to inequality for so long that equality can look like inequality to us. I think there's a similar thing happening with young men, where it's like when you demand as a woman something very equitable, that can feel to them like a form of oppression. I think that's, our generation's burden to bear. But I think ultimately where we are probably not succeeding in providing alternative messaging is that there is a version of success and joy and community and love that exists without the idea need to get there by trampling on other people. And only if you put yourself through, the most arduous of regimes, that I guess, like in many cases, I don't even know if these guys abide by. I don't know. Maybe they do. Maybe Tate does like 1,000 push-ups every morning. Who knows? I don't think we have yet provided an alternative narrative, because everything is about stories, right? Everyone buys into a story of success. And what does our story of success look like? Where does love fit into that? And where does an empowered version of a just and equitable masculinity fit into that picture? I don't think we have discussed it enough, because we've mainly been caught up in trying to respond to the right's, drift towards extreme views. And as usual, whether it's on this subject or others, it's a distraction. It keeps us from doing the work necessary to think about what we would want to, regardless of their BS. And so I think we just probably need to spend less time trying to counter people like Tate, who's now in a jail somewhere in Romania, maybe, and more time focusing on like some of the beautiful badass men that we have who are actually doing the work and being exceptional, and maybe promoting them a little bit more and showing what that version of masculinity looks like.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with the idea of demonstrating a loving form of masculinity rather than, as it were, demanding it, and as Tate and others do, in exchange for money. Just on Andrew Tate, my understanding is that he's not in jail, and indeed he's no longer under house arrest. A court released him, although he remains under judicial control, I think, pending the outcome of a criminal investigation. Right, we're going to wrap up there. Myriam, thank you so much for joining me tonight. It's been great to have you on the show, really great.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And for everyone watching, please come back tomorrow for another live show at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.